Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are here to take this enormous stack of information you've given us, all the articles, the leaked internal reports, the economic data, and deliver a precise synthesis.
Exactly.
And today, we are deep diving into something that's been at the core of recent global instability. The massive, sustained protests sweeping across Iran.
Yeah, this is a deep dive that really, it requires us to look beyond just the viral videos, the headlines, and to understand the structural dynamics at play.
Right.
Our mission today is pretty clear. We need to synthesize the true core drivers, which, as the data shows, are overwhelmingly economic. And then we have to meticulously map out the high-stakes geopolitical implications swirling around this internal instability.
Yeah.
The stakes are, well, they're existential for the regime, and they're potentially catastrophic for the global economy.
That dual focus is so crucial, isn't it? Because this isn't just a story about social frustration.
Not at all.
It's a critical study in how decades of political stagnation and economic collapse finally force a breaking point. And that, in turn, draws this intense global scrutiny and, well, these threats of intervention.
Precisely. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately. I think we have to start with that single visual image, the one that really captured the world's attention and, I think, perfectly symbolized the depth of this defiance.
I know exactly the one you mean.
We're talking about the video that just spread globally. An Iranian woman. She's holding a photograph of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei.
Yeah.
And she's using that sacred image to light her cigarette.
That moment was, it was instantly iconic, and it's because it's a pure, unadulterated act of desacralization. It's taking the sacred and making it profane.
Explain that a little more. What does that image really represent?
Well, the image of the supreme leader represents the absolute pinnacle of political and religious authority in Iran. It's everywhere. It's meant to be revered.
What?
Exactly. So to use it as mere kindling, as a trivial fuel source for such a personal, almost nonchalant act, it just signals a complete collapse of reverence, a collapse of respect for the entire ruling structure.
And it wasn't just a one-off viral moment, was it?
Yeah.
Our sources say that act actually established a trend.
It did. It was viewed across Western social media as this ultimate symbol of defiance, and that symbolism quickly translated into widespread physical acts of rebellion. It suggested to the global audience, and maybe more importantly to the domestic audience, that the supreme authority was no longer sacred.
No longer untouchable.
Correct. And our synthesis really confirms this is not just a flash in the pan. The sources we have, they repeatedly use the phrase never before seen protests.
Never before seen.
Right. So this isn't a small contingent of, urban intellectuals or a few localized demonstrations. This is a large-scale nationwide uprising. It involves both men and women, and it's cutting across all these socioeconomic and regional demographics.
Which suggests a really broad, deep societal discontent.
A very deep discontent. But the visibility of it, it's undeniable. And the global narrative often zeroes in on the most, let's say, the most visually understandable grievances.
Of course.
So international media, they tend to highlight the fury over social restrictions, specifically the mandatory hijab rules.
Which, of course, gained global prominence following the tragic death of Mahsa Amini in police custody. That was the immediate emotional spark, right?
That was the spark, absolutely. But if we really synthesize the deep source material, we find something else. We find that while the social fury is the visible catalyst, it's the immediate call to arms, the deepest, most sustained reason people are taking to the streets.
Yeah.
The reason they're enduring this risk and continuing the struggle, it's overwhelmingly economic. It's a structural failure of the ability to just survive.
So we have to maintain this crucial balance. It's like two tracks running at the same time. The outrage over oppression, the mandatory hijab, the morality police, the denial of basic rights, that provides the moral clarity.
Yes, and the specific case that galvanizes global attention.
Right. But the engine that's driving this massive, sustained fire, the structural reason people are willing to face down state violence, that's the systemic collapse of their economy, of their future.
History tells us this pattern is almost universally true. You see it again and again. Oppressive social laws or, specific brutal acts are often the immediate trigger. They're the catalyst that brings people out into the daylight. But a movement only maintains the scale and the intensity that we're seeing right now when the fundamental social contract has been shredded by economic desperation.
When you can't feed your family.
Exactly. When people are literally choosing between compliance and feeding their families, the fear of the government, it just begins to lose its hold. And that right there is the point of no return.
And considering the longevity of the current regime, I mean, the fact that this economic desperation has led to never-before-seen protests, that really underscores just how long that pressure must have been building beneath the surface.
Oh, for decades. This anger is decades in the making. The Masa Amini case, it provided a recent relatable face for systemic oppression, for sure.
A symbol.
A powerful symbol. But the underlying rot has been the erosion of purchasing power, the total lack of opportunity, and the systematic failure of economic policy to provide any kind of stability for the non-elite class.
So it's this blend of moral outrage and just sheer desperation that creates such an explosive political mixture.
A truly explosive mixture.
Okay, so this level of instability, it demands a severe response from the state.
Yeah.
And the intensity of that response, I think, it revealed the depth of their concern.
It reveals their panic.
Right. When protests are being reported on and even celebrated globally, the government knows it's facing an existential threat. And the Iranian government's reaction, detailed in the sources we have, is one of deep, palpable panic.
The reaction wasn't just severe, it was. It was metaphysically loaded. The Attorney General issued a warning that fundamentally altered the legal status of the protesters.
How so?
He classified them as enemies of God. The specific term used, morphed, which means spreading corruption on earth. It elevates dissent from just a political crime
To a religious one.
to a religious act against the divine order itself.
And that classification, that goes far beyond standard riot control or even, say, treason charges. What does the designation enemies of God actually translate to in Iran's historical and legal framework? I mean, what's the practical implication?
The implication is immediate and chilling. Those captured face potential death penalty charges.
The death penalty.
Yes. This isn't just the threat of imprisonment. It's an absolute threat to your life designed to instill maximum terror. Historically, Iran has used this designation for, political opponents and those involved in armed struggle or major sabotage.
So it's violent crimes.
Exactly. Applying it to peaceful street protesters dramatically lowers the threshold for capital punishment.
And this policy is reinforced by their historical tendency toward using these highly visible public executions to silence political dissent.
Yes, the goal is clearly to send an absolute, unambiguous message. Participation equals a potential death sentence.
But this leads us to a critical paradox the regime faces, doesn't it? The paradox of scale.
The paradox of scale, exactly. If the protest numbers are truly unprecedented, as our sources indicate, the act of labeling everyone involved an enemy of God becomes a self-defeating proposition.
How do you mean?
Well, if the state is forced to define a massive percentage of its own population as mortal, divine enemies, doesn't that fundamentally undermine the regime's claim to represent the people?
It's like saying a huge chunk of your own country is against God.
Precisely. If we're talking about a movement involving potentially millions of people, labeling them all enemies of God, effectively means the ruling structure is declaring war on a very large population of its own citizens. It deletes the power of that terrifying spiritual title.
But at the same time,
It simultaneously highlights the extreme, desperate nature of the state's panic. It shows they're reacting to the sheer volume of defiance, not just the quality of the opposition. They feel they can't politically afford to back down, but they may not be able to logistically sustain mass arrests and mass executions either.
and on top of that, to manage this crisis internally and to prevent the evidence of state violence and just the sheer scale of the protests from reaching the international community, they've imposed widespread internet blackouts.
The internet blackout is a hallmark move of a panicked authoritarian regime. It's right out of the playbook.
And it serves multiple purposes, I assume.
It serves three crucial practical functions. First, it cuts off communication and coordination among the protesters, making it harder to organize the next friends of the movement.
Makes sense.
Second, it prevents citizens from capturing video and photographic evidence of state brutality, which helps them manage the domestic narrative of the crackdown.
Control the story. And the
Yeah.
third function.
The third function is, ironically, economic control. While the regime is panicking over the protests, the blackout paralyzes the small remaining digital economy. It hurts businesses, and it further isolates the population.
So they're willing to inflict further economic damage.
The very source of the protests.
Right. The very thing that started this, just to maintain political control.
This desperate measure just underscores that they view these demonstrations as an existential threat. It signals they're willing to use the most extreme spiritual, legal, and communicative tools at their disposal to stop them.
This desperation also brings up a crucial internal structural question that connects right back to the economy.
Go on.
If they're willing to threaten life itself, it's because the economic foundation beneath them is crumbling. So my question is, if 30% of the population is in absolute poverty, as we're about to discuss, how long can the regime expect its security forces and its lower-level loyalists, whose own families are also affected by this economic collapse, to remain unified and ruthless? Is their loyalty system structurally sound enough to withstand this?
That is the ultimate structural weakness. It's the question that keeps the regime up at night. In a protest driven purely by, say, social reform, the police and the military often feel insulated. Their lives aren't directly impacted in the same way.
But this is different.
This is completely different. When the protest is driven by hyperinflation and poverty, their own families are suffering the same fate. They go home at night to the same empty shelves.
And historically, that's the tipping point.
Historically, successful revolutions hinge on the moment security forces defect, or at the very least hesitate. And so the extreme severity of the enemies of God decree is, in part, a tool to intimidate the security forces themselves into absolute obedience. It's reminding them of the consequences of hesitation, because the regime knows their loyalty is compromised by the economic reality we're about to explore.
Okay, we've established that the protests are sustained by desperation. Now we have to dive into the catastrophic numbers. Because people only risk the death penalty when their basic stability is fundamentally threatened. And the economic reality detailed in our sources is, well, it's staggering.
It really is. The foundation of this entire crisis lies in the currency catastrophe, specifically with the Iranian rial, the IRR, versus the US dollar. This is the clearest metric of both external pressure and internal mismanagement.
And this is where we need to highlight that one data point that it almost challenges belief. It's a figure that sources insist is read correctly and is absolutely critical to grasping the depth of this disaster.
It is. The crucial data point is this. $1 US, $1 USD, is equivalent to 1.4 million Iranian rial.
1.4 for $1. I mean, that's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is. Think about it this way. Imagine if, a loaf of bread that cost you maybe $4 or $5 here suddenly costs millions of whatever your local currency is. It's not just that things are expensive. It's that the money in your pocket, the money in your bank account has fundamentally lost its meaning.
It's just paper at that point.
Yeah, exactly. It's just paper. We need to linger on what that means for the daily life of an average Iranian, especially those outside the ruling elite. When the currency is this devastated, the impact is felt immediately on every single level of society that requires any interaction with the outside world.
So imports.
Imports are a perfect example. Iran relies on imports for medicine, for certain industrial components, even for specialized food items. So if the cost of importing 1 unit of medicine suddenly requires 1.4 million rial,
it just becomes inaccessible.
Completely inaccessible for all but the extremely wealthy. It's the same for education abroad, buying foreign technology, even importing spare parts for domestic industry. It becomes economically impossible. The entire country becomes isolated and impoverished by this single exchange rate.
And domestically, the fear of that complete currency collapse and the inability to import goods that drives hyperinflation.
It's a vicious cycle. That hyperinflation is reflected immediately in the core data we have. The headline inflation rate is a shocking 42%.
42%, which is already incredibly high.
Incredibly high. But that figure actually smooths out the reality. When you break down the inflation rate by sector, especially focusing on necessities, the situation moves from severe economic difficulty to a full-blown humanitarian crisis.
And that drill down is terrifying. The sources noted that food item prices rose a massive 72% last year alone.
Yes, and the sources didn't stop there. This is a key point. They specified that food item prices were projected to increase another 72% in the coming year, in 2025.
Another 72%.
Yes. So we're emphasizing a sustained, massive hike over multiple years that is simply impossible for ordinary citizens to absorb. This is the very definition of the cost of living crisis that is driving people to the streets.
Let's connect those abstract percentages to specific commodities. Can you detail the impact on basic necessities, things like bread, milk?
Sure. When essential goods like bread, milk, cooking oil, when they see price increases in the region of 72% year on year, it means survival itself becomes unaffordable. I mean, imagine your income remains stagnant, which it does for most of the non-elite workforce. But the core elements of your family's diet cost twice as much this year as they did just 2 years ago. This doesn't just reduce your quality of life, it forces families to make impossible choices. like taking children out of school so they can work, or simply cutting back on essential nutrition. These aren't choices anyone should have to make.
And this systemic pressure, it breaks the bedrock of society, the middle class.
Yeah.
The source we looked at cites that this inflation has, and I'm quoting here, broken the back of the middle class.
That is a crucial observation. The middle class, which is the traditional stabilizer in any society, is being economically purged.
What does that mean, purged?
It means these are people who worked for decades, saved diligently in bank accounts. Maybe they aspired to send a child to university or purchase a home. Now they find that money held in real can purchase almost nothing.
So their life savings are just gone.
Evaporated. The buffer they had against instability is gone. And this erosion of future security and stability is what the sources cite as the ultimate reason people take to the streets. It overrides other specific issues because it moves beyond political disagreement into a fight for literal life and death.
And this desperation, it must feed directly into the intense rage over wealth concentration and inequality.
Oh, absolutely.
Our sources highlight an extreme disparity that signals a fundamentally broken system.
Or
1% of Iran's population holds 1/3 of the country's total wealth.
1/3. That is wealth concentration at a level that shows the economic failure is selective. It's not just external sanctions causing the pain, it's the internal mechanisms that allow an elite, one that's closely connected to the ruling structure, to not only withstand the collapse, but to actually profit from it.
So the system is rigged.
The vast disparity highlights that the system is designed to insulate the elite from the suffering of the masses.
We should probably talk about the role of bonyads here. These are these powerful, often religiously affiliated foundations or trusts that control massive sectors of the Iranian economy. Are they the beneficiaries of this wealth concentration?
Yes, absolutely. The bonyads are a huge part of this story. They operate largely outside of regular governmental financial accountability. They often receive state assets or monopoly control over key industries.
And they're actually to the top.
Because they're often tied directly to the supreme leader or the Revolutionary Guard, they are uniquely positioned to navigate sanctions or even exploit the gaps created by sanctions. This allows them to accumulate massive wealth while ordinary citizens suffer.
So it's not just capitalism.
It's not capitalism, it's cronyism and structural immunity. And that is what fuels the popular rage that the 1% holds 1/3 of the wealth.
And this inequality is rapidly translating into widespread absolute destitution. The data shows that 30% of the population is now living in absolute poverty.
Let's ground that data in reality for a moment. Iran's population is approximately 90 million people. 30% in absolute poverty means roughly 27 million people are struggling just to meet basic survival needs. Food, shelter, rudimentary healthcare. That is a humanitarian crisis of immense scale that is currently the hidden engine beneath these political protests.
And this poverty isn't just confined to one area, is it? It's spreading, though the source does note it's particularly acute in rural areas.
Right. Rural areas often lack the political voice and the economic diversification of large urban centers. So when agricultural incomes collapse or local industries fail due to national economic policies or shortages, the people in these areas are immediately pushed into absolute poverty.
But it's not a new problem.
No, and this is critical. The sources emphasize that the general poverty rate has been rising for several decades. This tells you that the economic contract has been fraying not just for a year or two because of specific sanctions, but due to a long-term systemic failure of the governance model established way back in 1979.
So the combination of these figures, the annihilation of the rial, the 72% food inflation, the 27 million people in poverty, it just paints a picture of a nation where the populace has nothing left to lose.
Nothing left to lose. The financial foundation of the regime's stability has utterly dissolved.
Which brings us to the political structure itself.
Exactly. If the economic collapse we just detailed is the immediate life-threatening cause forcing millions onto the streets,
then the political structure is the reason those grievances have no safe, legitimate, or structural outlet.
precisely. The political system funnels all this economic rage directly into confrontation. There's nowhere else for it to go.
So what is the core structural problem that prevents the government from being held accountable for this multi-decade economic collapse and the ensuing humanitarian crisis?
Well, the problem is a lack of accountability rooted in history. To put it simply, Iran has not had what you or I would call a proper fair election since 1979, and that is the single defining fact of the political landscape.
But they do hold elections, right, for president and parliament.
They do, but these elections are not truly democratic. They're more of a performance.
How does the system ensure that? How does it ensure they're merely a performance and not a mechanism for real political change?
It all comes down to the vetting process. That's the choke point. All ultimate power rests squarely with the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and the institutions he controls, particularly the Guardian Council.
The Guardian Council.
Yes. This council, whose members are either directly or indirectly appointed by the supreme leader, vets every single candidate for every major office president, parliament, even the assembly of experts.
So they decide who can even run.
They decide who gets on the ballot. And only those who are ideologically vetted and approved by this hardline, unelected body are allowed to run. This ensures that genuine reformists, or crucially, anyone who might seriously challenge the economic status quo, are eliminated before the voter ever sees their name.
So this concentration of power means there's no real separation of powers. The supreme leader controls the judiciary, the military, the legislative agenda, and the vetting process.
Correct. There is no legitimate political mechanism for the public to safely or effectively register their discontent over economic failure. If the president or parliament tries to enact reforms, the Guardian Council or the supreme leader can simply overrule them. The public understands this. They know that voting changes nothing fundamental.
Which is why their only remaining recourse is the street.
It's the only option left.
And we touched on media censorship earlier. The absence of a free media has to be an essential component of preserving this structure.
It's the systemic blindness of the regime. The lack of transparent and free media ensures that the true extent of the economic suffering, especially in those rural areas we discussed, and the sheer mismanagement responsible for these soaring poverty rates, it all remains hidden from widespread internal scrutiny, at least among the elite.
Which contributes to the public sense of being governed by an indifferent, opaque, dictatorial elite.
Exactly. An elite who simply do not understand or care about the 27 million people living in absolute poverty.
So let's bring it back to the mandatory hijab rule and the social restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
We should understand them not just as cultural issues, but as tools of this unchallengeable political power.
That's the right way to see them.
So while the economy is the primary driver, the severity of the enforcement, symbolized by the death of Mahsa Amini, provides that secondary, specific spark.
These social restrictions are the most visible face of the regime's control over daily life. They are constant, intrusive reminders that the state is dictatorial even in the most personal spheres of your life.
And the morality police are the instrument of that control.
Yes. So when the morality police are seen as directly responsible for the death of a young woman, it transforms the abstract rage over economic injustice into this concrete emotional fury against perceived government oppression. The population isn't just angry about money anymore. They're furious that the government exercises lethal, unaccountable control over their bodies and their movements.
So the overall fury driving these never-before-seen protests is that potent and volatile combination we identified earlier.
A perfect storm.
It's fury over money that has no value because of systemic corruption, married to the emotional outrage that the regime is willing to kill its own citizens to enforce what some see as trivial social rules.
And this explains why the regime, in turn, is using the most extreme spiritual weapon it possesses, that enemies of God designation. They understand that this movement is rooted in a fundamental, comprehensive rejection of the entire structure, political, social, and economic. They are fighting for regime survival against an economically driven mass movement that has no safe political outlet other than revolution.
The stage is set internally. Now we have to look outside, because a crisis of this magnitude in a major regional power never unfolds in isolation.
It never does. There are always other players on the board.
Okay, so given the profound internal instability, the economic collapse, the mass poverty, the government panic, this situation immediately attracts high-level external interest, particularly from actors who have long sought to change the Iranian political landscape.
Yes, and our sources clearly lay out the U.S. and Israeli perspective on this instability, and it is far from passive.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, the external interests are extremely transparent and highly ambitious. Both the U.S. and Israel openly desire regime change in Iran. Their strategic goal is to replace the current theocratic, anti-Western government with a pro-West government.
And this objective is viewed as strategically easier than a full-scale direct military conflict.
A direct war would be an unimaginable drain on resources and could potentially trigger a massive regional war. So instead of war, they view this internal unrest as a ready-made asset to achieve regime change through proxy.
A tool.
A tool, yes. The sources specifically note that the U.S. public is highly supportive of the protests, especially seeing Iranian women fighting for basic rights and freedoms. But at the strategic level, the sources add a crucial detail
Which is?
that countries like the U.S. and Israel possess expertise in orchestrating mass protests, supporting dissident groups, and managing the dynamics of a revolution. This implies they aren't just cheering from the sidelines, they're equipped to actively participate in this process of internal transformation.
And this context is what frames the extraordinarily high-stakes statements made by former President Donald Trump regarding potential U.S. involvement. What was the core message there?
He stated clearly and publicly that the U.S. is watching the situation very closely. His core message framed these protests not just as a tragedy, but as a golden opportunity to use the Iranian people's frustration to attempt a coup or regime change.
He even benchmarked it, didn't he?
He did. He called this potential outcome a 100 times bigger victory than what the U.S. achieved in Venezuela, and that indicates the immense strategic value they place on destabilizing and ultimately overthrowing this regime.
Why does he frame it as a victory 100 times larger than Venezuela? What is the geopolitical significance of Iran that makes this potential regime change so incredibly valuable?
Because a pro-U.S. Iran would fundamentally reset the balance of power in the entire Middle East. It would cripple the so-called axis of resistance that includes Hezbollah and various militias. It would dramatically strengthen Israel's strategic position, ensure stability in the Gulf oil fields, and end decades of confrontation dating all the way back to the 1979 revolution.
So from a U.S. strategic perspective, it would be the single greatest geopolitical shift in the region in half a century.
Easily.
This elevates the stakes from just political support to something far more aggressive, especially when we look at his specific threat of intervention. What were the parameters of that threat?
Trump stated that if Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, and he claimed this is the country's custom, that the U.S. will come to their rescue. This is the threshold. This is the tripwire for escalating from observation and political support to direct, kinetic military action. The U.S. is essentially setting a red line for Iranian state violence.
And crucially, he clarified how the U.S. would intervene. He specifically ruled out boots on the ground, but implied something far more devastating than economic sanctions.
He spoke of hitting them very, very hard where it hurts, and this implies the activation of the U.S. Air Force and significant aerial support. We need to just linger on that for a second. The U.S. is proposing air support for a domestic coup.
Which changes the definition of proxy war entirely.
Completely. The implied target of this aerial support would be to help protesters access key government buildings or structures, effectively providing air cover or strategic strikes to dismantle the regime's ability to coordinate its defense and suppress the revolution.
So this scenario suggests that the U.S. Air Force would act in direct military support of non-state actors, the protesters, against a sovereign government.
Yes.
That's a profound and highly risky escalation of geopolitical rhetoric. It takes the situation out of the realm of intelligence operations and into open warfare.
Exactly. The risk is immense. Just imagine the U.S. Air Force targeting Iranian military bases, state media facilities, or the headquarters of the Revolutionary Guard to disable their command and control structure, specifically to give the protesters an edge.
It would immediately transform the domestic protest into a declared proxy conflict,
with massive implications for regional stability, to put it mildly. And this profound tension is underscored by a specific quote attributed to U.S.-Israel interests, one that shows their state of readiness.
What's the quote?
The specific quote is, "We are locked and loaded, ready to go. Thank you for your attention to this matter."
Locked and loaded, ready to go.
This is not casual rhetoric. It indicates a state of military preparedness and a perceived window of opportunity that these external powers feel is wide open due to the combination of Iran's internal economic collapse and the popular fury driving the protests.
So the key takeaway for you, the listener, is that Iran's internal crisis is viewed externally not just as a tragedy to be observed,
No.
but as a calculated geopolitical asset to be exploited for regime change.
Yeah.
The level of explicit military preparedness transforms this internal protest movement into a high-stakes global chess game, where intervention is a real, stated possibility if the regime reaches a certain threshold of violence in its crackdown.
A very dangerous game.
We are witnessing historic days unfold. The immediate future of the Middle East and the global economy hinges on the outcome in Tehran, which our sources break down into two critical scenarios, both carrying massive implications.
The first scenario is the possibility that the protest is crushed. Despite the unprecedented scale of the uprising and the fundamental economic drivers, the Iranian government, utilizing the ruthless means we discussed, could successfully reassert control and maintain power.
Do we have a modern precedent or a successful model for how a powerful authoritarian regime manages to crush such a widespread, popular, and economically driven dissent?
We do. The sources reference the example of how Vladimir Putin crushed protests in Russia. The core of that success was absolute, seamless cooperation between the army, the security forces, and the political leadership.
They were all on the same page.
Completely. They worked together to maintain an iron grip, successfully preventing outside infiltration from turning the domestic unrest into a full-scale revolution. If the Iranian regime can ensure its key security forces, the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij militia, remain unified, loyal, and ruthless enough to enact mass arrests and public executions, they could replicate that model.
But even if the protest is successfully crushed domestically, the threat of external intervention doesn't just disappear, because the initial condition for U.S. intervention still exists.
Exactly right. Even a successful, ruthless crackdown could trigger the threshold for U.S. military action. The aerial strike threat from the U.S. remains, based specifically on the condition articulated by Donald Trump, if the regime resorts to massive violence and kills peaceful protesters.
And the U.S. has already rhetorically framed the regime's custom as being to kill protesters.
So they've already set the stage for that justification. This means that a successful domestic suppression, one involving high body counts, could paradoxically trigger the external intervention that the regime was trying to prevent in the first place.
Aimed at assisting remaining dissident forces or directly targeting government structures.
Yes. That structural risk sets up the second, and perhaps most globally catastrophic scenario: geopolitical retaliation.
What does that look like?
Well, if the Iranian government successfully suppresses the protests and survives this existential threat, they might feel the need to send an overwhelmingly strong geopolitical message to the world. A clear signal designed to retaliate against the external powers, the U.S. and Israel, that tried to exploit their instability for regime change.
A show of force?
The ultimate show of force. The source material is explicit about the ultimate escalation that Iran has in its arsenal, an act designed to punish the world for its perceived interference. They could choke the Strait of Hormuz.
We have to elaborate on the significance of this choke point for our listener.
Yeah.
Why is the Strait of Hormuz the single most potent geopolitical lever that Iran holds?
The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow sea channel connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. It is, by far, the world's most strategically important maritime choke point.
Why is that?
A vast, disproportionate percentage of the world's daily oil supply, we're talking approximately 20% of global oil consumption, and 30% of all sea-traded oil passes through that narrow waterway. It traverses Iranian and Omani territorial waters. Its closure is a threat to the global energy supply chain unlike almost any other.
So what does choking the Strait of Hormuz practically entail? Does it mean an outright military closure?
It could mean several things, but the effect is the same: rendering the passage unsafe for international tankers. Iran could use naval mines, highly coordinated fast-attack craft-like speedboats armed with missiles, or simply deploy overwhelming threats that make international insurance companies refuse to cover tankers passing through.
So if the tankers stop flowing,
The oil stops reaching the market.
and what would be the predicted immediate global impact of closing or even just severely disrupting the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz?
The impact would be immediate, severe, and global. First, the oil price. Brent crude prices would skyrocket. They could potentially double or triple overnight as the market attempts to account for a massive, sudden loss of supply.
And the stock markets.
The source material is clear. This action would cause global stock markets to panic and drop significantly.
We're talking about a major disruption to global commerce. Which sectors would feel this panic most acutely?
Any sector reliant on transport and high-energy input would be immediately paralyzed. Airlines, shipping companies, manufacturing, petrochemical industries, they would all see their operating costs jump astronomically.
Triggering mass layoffs.
Mass layoffs and potentially forcing entire supply chains to halt. This action would translate the domestic instability driven by $1 equaling 1.4 million rial directly into a threat that could trigger a global recession through a sudden oil supply disruption.
So the situation, as the sources emphasize, is very sensitive for the entire world. The fate of the Iranian regime is tied to the price of oil, the stability of global markets, and the potential for kinetic intervention by global powers.
The two scenarios, the regime crushing the protests or the regime retaliating against perceived foreign interference, They represent the dual and intertwined dangers facing the world today. Either way, these protests have irrevocably exposed a level of fragility in the Iranian regime that external powers are actively exploiting, and that fragility has the potential to trigger massive global consequences far beyond Tehran's borders. The ticking clock is the time until one of these two outcomes is realized.
So to sum this all up,
This deep dive has revealed a situation of profound complexity and, frankly, terrifying geopolitical risk. We've synthesized that the conflict is driven by a systemic economic failure demonstrated by currency annihilation, hyperinflation, and the subsequent mass poverty afflicting nearly one-third of the population.
and this is all compounded by decades of absolute political suppression by a regime with zero political tolerance for dissent.
Right. And overlaying this dangerous domestic instability is the intense open foreign interest led by the U.S. and Israel, which is focused entirely on achieving regime change and is explicitly locked and loaded for potential aerial intervention should the crackdown become violent enough to cross their stated red line.
The sources make it clear that the ultimate conflict is existential for the Iranian government.
And potentially catastrophic for the world if that escalation leads to the Strait of Hormuz being targeted. These protests are not merely an act of local dissent. They are now a primary focal point of global tension and economic risk.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, who now holds this knowledge? The sources, I think, they compel us toward a final consideration, a critical question that frames the entire conflict and forces everyone to reckon with the moral and political stakes involved.
The question the source material places before the world is this: do you support the Iranian protesters in their desire for change, knowing that change could bring about immense instability and foreign intervention? Or do you believe the status quo and the current government should remain in power, stabilizing the region through continued suppression?
That is the central, high-stakes decision facing the region and the world. Because whether the current regime falls or manages to survive, the decision by global actors to engage, to support, or to remain neutral will inevitably redefine the future of the Middle East.
And impact the global economy for decades to come.
A final thought to leave you with.
I think the key understanding, the one thing to mull over, is the immense difference between a government that can't feed its people and one that chooses not to. The evidence we've seen suggests Iran's crisis is a lethal cocktail of both.
Thank you for diving deep with us today.